Only in America.
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 This week, how we understand race and immigration often depends on who is reporting race and immigration.
If you cover what's been going on at the border, if you cover family detention, if you cover what they're calling family separation 2.0, there are Haitian immigrants there. There are Black immigrants in all of those stories. So I'm trying to get better at explicitly outlining that and reporting to make it clear to people that everywhere that you see injustices happening, like for immigrant communities, there are Black immigrants there that are at the center of it.
From the National Immigration Forum, I'm Ali Noorani, and this is Only in America. Reporters are human beings who, whether or not they realize it, bring their human experience to each and every story they write. The pejorative way to describe this is bias. I would describe it as being present and alive in the world you report. Look, our news sources shape how race and immigration impacts communities and how race and immigration shapes our political debate. An incredible responsibility comes with reporting these stories. How are they inclusive without being biased? Solutions-oriented without being prescriptive? A lack of diverse perspectives can also lead to some of the most important and newsworthy stories lacking the attention they deserve, both from editors and from the public alike. In major news stories like family separation at the border, we often heard more about people who shaped this inhumane policy than the people directly affected by it. We heard more about the politics around it than the root causes of what brought people to seek safety in the U.S. in the first place. Over time, this trend changed as reporters developed sources and relationships along the border and in Central America. But in many ways, the narrative was set. Immigration was a political challenge to be solved by policies, not a perfectly natural decision nearly anyone would make who sought better opportunities for them and their family. Now, as the confluence of race and immigration takes a prominent role in the American psyche, the reporting becomes really important. Because how we understand the immigrant experiences in America today is based more and more on how we understand race in America today. Many journalists in traditional newsrooms across the country are doing incredibly important work to highlight the voices and the perspectives of immigrants and people of color. But, like the industry overall, they face budget cuts, declining readership, and uncertainty about the future. Without these reporters working day in and day out to draw attention to situations like these in our country, we would have made significantly less progress. But among newsrooms and readers as a whole, there's more work to be done, and more attention needs to be directed towards the voices and the experiences of communities of color. As this week's guest wrote, it has become very clear to me that mainstream newsrooms can feel like deeply unwelcoming places, both for journalists with marginalized identities and journalists sincerely invested in shifting narratives about communities of color. Today, we're taking a closer look into some of these crucial yet underreported stories, and how one reporter is highlighting the perspective of communities directly affected by injustice. Got 2 minutes? We want to hear from you. What do you want to hear more about on Only in America? Do us a favor and take our survey at immigrationforum.org/podcast. We really appreciate your feedback.
Support for the National Immigration Forum comes from the Carnegie Corporation of New York, supporting innovations in education, democratic engagement, and strengthening international peace and security. And from Humanity United. When humanity is united, we can bring a powerful force for human dignity.
Here's what you'll hear on a new podcast called A Better Life. Great stories of immigrants grappling with the meaning of America during the coronavirus pandemic. And immigrant elders offering humor and advice for the rest of us trying to make it through these difficult times. At A Better Life, the host and virtually all the reporters are immigrants or the children of immigrants. A Better Life comes from Feet in Two Worlds, winner of multiple awards for journalism about and by immigrants. Listen to A Better Life wherever you get your podcasts.
My guest this week is Tina Vasquez. Tina is a senior reporter at Prism, where she leads coverage of both gender justice and workers' rights. Prism, as a newsroom, is a media outlet whose team is 100% led by women of color. Previously at Rewire News, Tina's work has also appeared in the New York Review of Books, NPR, and The Nation. She's a movement journalist with more than 10 years of experience focusing on immigration and culture, among other justice issues. Tina told me about movement journalism and her work building trust within the communities she reports on, including the Black immigrant community. How did you get into journalism?
I took the more complicated route. So I did not graduate from college. I went to community college, fell in love with journalism, but had already been doing journalism as a young person. Like in middle school and high school, I was already very interested in journalism and contributing to the local community paper and the editor of the school newspaper, all of that. And then I went to community college. I took a bunch of journalism classes, and then I dropped out to help my brother raise his children, and I needed income. And so I started freelancing, and I freelanced for a long time, like almost 10 years before I got my first real journalism job.
Okay, so you get the journalism bug. Where did you go from Downey?
I lived in Arizona for a little bit, came back. And then when I was 30, I applied for this fellowship at Rewire News. And it was supposed to be a racial justice reporting fellowship that I did not get. But they called me and they were like, hey, you talked about immigration so much in your interview. We have funding to do like an immigration reporting fellowship for you. And after 1 year, they hired me full time. So I became their full-time immigration reporter.
And what year was this?
Like 2015, around there.
So in that amount of time, I mean, that's kind of like when things really, I mean, immigration has always gone up, down, and upside down every 6 months or shorter. But you had the pen when Trump was elected. As a journalist, how did you internalize that? How did that become a part of your reporting, or did it?
No, it certainly did. I mean, I thought a lot about, I remember like leading up to the election, I was thinking through a lot of coverage about, I was trying to make sense of what it would be that Trump would be taking over. So I remember doing a lot of reporting that was like, here are the databases people should be worried about the Trump administration getting its hands on. Here are some of the things in the immigration system that the Obama administration could shut down before leaving office. And one of those things, of course, is family detention. So I remember spending a lot of time and reporting a lot on what existed that was already deeply horrible and how that could be like further weaponized by the Trump administration.
So give me the sense of kind of your journey at Rewire, and then, why you decided to leave and where you are now with Prism.
Sure. So it was tumultuous toward the end. We were trying to unionize in the middle of layoffs, and it was like kind of a bleak media atmosphere. So essentially I got laid off and felt very pushed out of journalism. I was applying everywhere that I could. And I've always, I don't know if it's because I have sort of like a loud mouth, or I've been very vocal about doing journalism in a different kind of way and not really adhering to the myth of objectivity, or if it's because I don't have a college degree. I don't know. But I had a lot of journalism experience and a lot of clips. And for the life of me, I could not find a job in journalism. So I actually left journalism for a little bit. And I worked at this place called Political Research Associates. That's it's like a social justice think tank. So I oversaw basically their gender and repro and sexuality team. So kind of investigating right-wing movements and working with researchers who did that work full time. And then I heard about Prism, which is where I work now. It's an all women of color newsroom. We largely report on, the people and the places and the issues that are really underreported by national media. And this job opened up, and I didn't think I was going to get it. I thought I was done with journalism. I was trying to make peace with that. But then I got the job. And so now I'm a senior reporter there, but I primarily cover gender, immigration, and workers' rights.
I've long known PRA's work. Do you think that your time, in essence, as kind of an advocate or a researcher there, inform the way that you practice journalism now?
That's a really good question. Yeah, I mean, I think they fundamentally changed how I think of journalism. As part of like my onboarding process, I had to go to the Values Voters Conference, which is like Christian nationalism on a stage for 2 days. And I didn't even know what that meant at the time. So I had to kind of go to this conference and sit there and, clap for Sebastian Gorka, and Trump was there, and all of these major right-wing players that I had been terrified of or like covering. And it was a really kind of transformational thing. I started to realize that they probably go to our conferences like we go to theirs, because a lot of their talking points were really interesting. They were like embracing the language of social justice movements, but really weaponizing it against them. And so I started to see opposition research as a part of journalism, or like a part of my job as a journalist. And I don't think without working at PRA, I would have ever developed that understanding.
So, you wrote this essay around movement journalism, and I'll ask you to kind of describe that. But what struck me about the piece is that you talked to a lot of different perspectives. You questioned your own assumptions as you were going through it. But what I took away is that whether you're a journalist or an advocate, we've got to be looking at these issues and how they are part of something bigger. And they're not just, your version of an objective set of facts. So tell me, what is movement journalism?
I mean, what's interesting is that I'm learning that it's very different depending on who's embracing it. Like, since that Neiman Reports article was published, a lot of journalists have reached out to me to talk about it. And it seems for a lot of folks, it has made them feel more comfortable transitioning from organizing and activism into journalism. Whereas I did not have that background. I've never been an organizer. I've never been an activist. And the kind of definition that I'm working with has been developed alongside this organization where I'm a board member called Press On. They're like a Southern media collective here in North Carolina that supports movement journalism. So the way that I'm defining it is that it's journalism that meets the needs of communities directly affected by injustice. It's very community focused. It's solutions based. It's journalism in service of liberation and that seeks to advance justice. And so you're very clear, or at least I'm very clear in being a movement journalist, that I don't always see myself as reporting on communities, but rather like alongside them or in collaboration with them. So I stay in touch with a lot of people that I have written about in the past or who do community organizing work. And I rely on them very heavily to tell me how I can best meet the needs of communities, right? So like, how can I gear my reporting around the information that they need rather than presuming to know what they need and reporting it out that way?
So in the context of kind of where we are right now as a country with the Black Lives Movement growing in power and influence over the summer, racial justice rallies happening across the country, what is the difference between kind of reporting on and telling the story of Black Lives Matter through a movement journalism framework versus a more mainstream framework?
I always toe this line because I love journalism and I hate it, but I feel like mainstream journalism gets a lot wrong. And in movement journalism, I feel like you don't have to pretend that you're not outraged by the conditions that you see. You don't have to pretend that you're not outraged by what you're reporting on. And you are often, in my experience at least, a member of the community that you are reporting on. And so I don't want to say that there aren't mainstream journalists that don't do their work this way, but I think that when you are able to identify as a movement journalist and move in the world in that way and really kind of disrupt how you think of sourcing or how you think of reporting or how you think about what it looks like to report on communities, that it leads to more nuanced reporting. We have folks at Prism like Anoa Changa and Tamar Sarai Davis. They cover like electoral justice and criminal justice. And I think of their reporting as so different. Like, they cover racial justice very broadly in their work, but it's, you don't get the sense that it's like removed from the reporting. They are a part of the reporting. I don't know another way to describe it.
No, it makes a lot of sense because, for us as an organization at the National Immigration Forum, we've been trying to think more about, okay, how do we understand immigration advocacy in the context of racial justice? And I guess my question would be, how have you thought about those two issues, or do you even see them as separate issues as you've done your reporting over time?
I mean, I don't see them as separate at all. I feel like for many years in my career, I made the great mistake and not realize that I did this, but that I largely covered immigration as a Latino issue and how devastating that is, that kind of erasure, and how it leads to a lot of misconceptions about immigration and who is impacted by immigration and who is subjected to certain policies. So as I kind of progressed in my career, I worked really hard to develop trust in Black immigrant communities. Today I spent the day, for example, working on this narrative from Juanita Thompson. So I'm doing this thing more now, it's called the As Told To format. So I do these very extensive interviews with a person, and then I piece their quotes together. So it's kind of them telling their story in their own words. This is a person who's been in sanctuary for more than 2 years. She's a Black woman. To my understanding, she and her husband are the first Black family to have a public sanctuary case. And we have stayed in touch since the first time I covered her. And I remember I sat down with her at her church the day that I met her. And her first question for me was, have you ever written about Black people before? Have you ever written about Black immigrants? And so there was this trust building process with her. And so we stay in touch now, but she reached out to me recently just to talk to me about how weird it's been for her to be stuck in a church as a Black immigrant for more than 2 years and to watch on TV as people nationwide are participating in uprisings as part of the movement for Black lives, and how forgotten and left behind she feels, and how she feels like people don't have an understanding that there are Black immigrants and that she's in this gigantic church in the middle of Philadelphia and just doesn't feel supported. And so I can't help but feel like for so many years, a lot of us, I think, have covered immigration as if it only impacts Latinos. And even now, if you cover what's been going on at the border, if you cover family detention, if you cover what they're calling family separation 2.0, there are Haitian immigrants there. There are Black immigrants in all of those stories. So I'm trying to get better at explicitly outlining that and reporting to make it clear to people that everywhere that you see injustices happening, like for immigrant communities, there are Black immigrants there that are at the center of it.
Yeah, I remember we went to the border last fall, and I would say in a shelter we visited in Juarez, there were half a dozen folks from Cameroon who were, just waiting along with everybody else for this IAM case.
Yeah, at Prism, we've done some work around, there's a woman that I'm in touch with quite a bit who does comms for various Black immigrant rights organizations. And she put me in touch with Cameroonian women at the Hutto Detention Center, which has been under a spotlight for many years by reporters because of abuse there. And there was a hunger strike by Cameroonian women who said that they weren't getting the medical care that they deserved. And there was not a lot of coverage about it.
How should the immigration movement be sharing information with journalists, just in essence doing a better job of highlighting and making clear to both journalists and through journalists, but also separately, this fact that racial justice and immigration, they're linked?
I mean, the thing that's I've noticed a lot as a journalist who's always worked at much smaller outlets is that, I feel like advocates and lawyers and all of these folks have this balance where, they have this information and they have stories and they know that they would benefit from coverage and from public attention. And so they have this impulse to kind of give information to journalists that have large followings or journalists that work for very large outlets. But those aren't necessarily journalists that are going to kind of dive into those nuances. And so I would say that I think it's a matter of reaching out to journalists that are trusted members of certain communities or that have developed trust in certain communities that are going to kind of dig into those nuances. I've been working a lot lately with this organization in North Carolina called Migrant Roots Media, and it was founded by an immigrant woman. And all the pieces that she publishes on the site are from immigrants who are kind of unpacking the root causes of migration. And so she has really taught me that in reporting, unless you get into all of that context and the root causes of migration and the reason why people's migrate and who actually is being subjected to specific policies, then you're really not doing your job.
So one of the stories that you broke was about the immigration lawyer, Peter Shea, and kind of how his positioning around binary choice and family separation was really running completely counter to the goals of other advocates or lawyers, much less the families themselves. If you don't mind kind of walking through that story a little bit, because when I read it, I saw it as something that, the conventional wisdom that Peter Shea is kind of a leading immigrant rights lawyer, he had the right strategy. And if he said something, we should all kind of assume that it's right. It feels like your approach to journalism kind of led you to a very different place.
Yeah, that reporting was really scary and really challenging. I'm in touch with a lot of immigration attorneys that I've technically known, for a lot of years because I've covered immigration for so long and I've covered family detention for so long. And so I just kind of started to hear rumblings. A lot of attorneys were kind of reaching out to me to tell me things that they were seeing and basically saying, if you look at court documents, it will kind of tell its own story. But I work at a very small outlet and I don't have access to Pacer. So there were a lot of challenges in reporting the story. But, if you Google Peter Shea, everywhere, he comes up as like this human rights defender, right? This like famous attorney who seems very lauded. And one immigration attorney told me that it's the media that shows that kind of reverence for him, but it's certainly not the people that work alongside him. So it just felt terrifying, because the thing that I worried about so much, and I think the thing that kept people quiet for a lot of years about Peter Shea, is that you are afraid that the very base level protections that children in detention have, which is the Flores Settlement Agreement, which he is lead counsel on, if you are to, report anything about Peter Shea or about Flores critically, there is a fear about how that could be used. One attorney who never wanted to go on the record with me tried to talk me out of doing the reporting by asking me to consider what would happen if Stephen Miller saw my reporting, like what would that do to Flores? And so I had a lot of concerns about the piece. But at the end of the day, I always think of the families that are in detention and how they're being faced with this binary option, and they shouldn't be faced with that at all, especially not before they go through the asylum process. But it's essentially, you get to keep your child in this prison with you where a virus is spreading and possibly waive their Flores rights, or they get released to a sponsor in the US and it is completely unknown if you are terminating your parental rights. And that's just not a choice that somebody who is supposed to be advocating for them should be forcing them to make.
And it felt like you got to that place because of, like you said, the long-term relationship you've had with other lawyers, but just a deep understanding of family detention because, yes, you had a lot of files to go through, but you brought a lot to that story.
Yeah, I wish that I had like these super great investigative skills and that I was super great at FOIAs and that I had all of these, internal sources at DHS. That's just not how I work. Like, I get the stories that I get because I maintain trusting relationships with people. I don't violate their trust. And I stay in touch with them over many years. And I show them through my reporting that I'm a person that they can trust. And so through those kinds of relationships and that kind of relationship building, I was able to get the story. And that's, among the stories that I get that are bigger, kind of make waves like that, it always starts with interviews for me and those kinds of relationships.
Like you said, instead of reporting on the movement, reporting in essence alongside the movement.
Yeah.
So one question I have about movement journalism, and you bring this up in different ways in the essay a little bit, is kind of this idea of being objective. But that's not my question. What I'm always fixated on is like, okay, how is this story or this narrative helping someone who doesn't understand the journey, the struggle of an immigrant or of an immigrant community? How does this story help them understand it? My initial reaction before I read the essay was like, okay, movement journalism, you're reporting on the choir to the choir. Right. So how do you avoid that? Or are you comfortable with that?
That is such a good question. So I will say, what's really interesting is that I think Prism has a very particular audience. And in that way, I am very much preaching to the choir. But everything, like our co-publishing partner is Daily Kos, and they have a huge readership and they have a very different readership. I believe like in terms of demographics that they've released, it's predominantly older people who are white and identify as liberals. And they also have a comment section, which Prism doesn't have. And I can see when my reporting goes up there, that folks just don't understand it, that they don't understand it, they don't agree with it. And it's hard to see because I put so much effort into what I report and how I report it. And I realize those are like tough moments where I wonder what is the benefit of the reporting I'm doing if it is essentially preaching to the choir and this group of people, this much larger group of people who has a lot of power, read my reporting and they push back on it entirely or don't agree with my framing. It's hard. I don't have a good answer for that, but I have been really challenged by that.
But I mean, what I hear you saying is that actually the choir may not be as big as we assume.
Also, yes, definitely. I remember when I was hired at Rewire News, so they were like a website that focused on reproductive rights, health, and justice, and they hired an immigration reporter. And I remember like very early on, I never read the comments, but I was just curious to see how people were responding to my work because I was their first ever immigration reporter. And there was a lot of mostly like white women very confused as to why this Repro website had hired an immigration reporter. And that's when I started to realize that, I audiences are so strange. And, I've been asked before, like, who do you write for? And I guess I write for the communities that I report on. And I don't think very far beyond that. But of course, you want people to develop understandings based on your reporting. I mean, I basically see reporting as public education, but that's not comfortable for a lot of people if you report on things in a certain way.
But it's also kind of this moment where even a more liberal audience is increasingly sensitive to racial justice questions and issues and challenges. Maybe there's a different way that they are seeing not just stories that you would kind of characterize as racial justice, but also now around immigration as well.
Yeah, I mean, I anticipate, I have no idea how this election will shake out, but I see my job as being critical of whoever the administration is. On social media, people will say, you're only saying this, you're only reporting this under Trump, but nobody could ever point to a positive article I wrote about the Obama administration when it comes to immigration. That's not my job. My job is to be critical, and my job is to report on what is happening to communities and how immigration policies are playing out in their lives. And as kind of election stuff ramps up and I'm thinking through election coverage, I anticipate a lot of pushback in how I will report on Biden and his immigration team.
Yeah. So there's one thing that you wrote in your essay that I wanted you to kind of maybe unpack a little bit here that reminded me of this. And you said, "It's my firm belief that the more layered a reporter's identity is, the more nuanced their work. In fact, one of journalism's greatest scams was making marginalized reporters feel like our identities are a detriment."
Yeah.
Yeah. So like, how does that then lead to a story that not just has a nuanced narrative, but lands in a place where somebody can say, okay, this is the solution?
Oh gosh, that's so hard. I mean, I firmly believe, I will make this very personal. I firmly believe that I report on immigration the way that I do and that I always have because I am the daughter of an immigrant, because there are undocumented people in my family, because many of my chosen family members are undocumented. And growing up with these people in my life, you see how things play out. You see what the reality is, and then you kind of compare what is being reported in the news. So I came up in feminist media, and I remember pitching articles sometimes about feminism and immigration and really having editors say, like, how is immigration a feminist issue? Or seeing like queer organizers that were doing all of these acts of civil disobedience under the Obama administration, and there being no reporting about undocuqueer people. So I don't know. I feel like when you are in community with people, when you belong to the communities that you report on, the solutions are so much more clear to you. The challenges are so much more clear. The issues are so much more clear. It just leads to like very deep reporting, more nuanced reporting. And if you're like not digging into those nuances, you're not doing your job. And so I really do think that movement journalism can be an antidote to so much of the kind of misleading, bad reporting that we see in immigration in particular.
Especially at a time when the country is just being rocked by all these points of tension, again, around immigration issues, racial issues, et cetera. So last question for you. This may be the toughest. It's a question I ask everybody. So the name of the podcast is Only in America. Finish the sentence of Only in America, ... That was one heck of a sigh.
Yeah, this is so troubling. I mean, I do feel like only in America could I be the kind of journalist that I am.
Thank you. I really appreciate your time, Tina. Thank you. And more than that, I just greatly appreciate the work that you're doing and the way that you do your work. So thank you.
Thank you so much for having me.
Tina Vasquez is a senior reporter at Prism. You can learn more about Tina at our website, immigrationforum.org/podcast. And stay tuned for our next series about immigration and civic engagement in the weeks leading up to Election Day. Because, there is an election coming up. Now, we would love to hear your feedback on our 2-minute survey. Go to immigrationforum.org/podcast to shape our future episodes. If you like what you hear, subscribe to Only in America on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen to podcasts. Only in America is produced and edited by a fantastic team: Joanna Taylor, Megan Wetmore, and Becca Wall. Our artwork and graphics are designed by Carla Leha. I'm Ali Nurani, and I will talk to you next week.